Hey guys, my name is Rands, and today on the Booster Pack Singles, we're going to be talking about IP or licensed trading card games or collectible card games. Those are games that use a media franchise from outside of the gaming space to sell their game and base their game on those properties. Now, we're going to be talking about over the last 30 years what those types of games have done, and we're going to be talking about what the future might hold for those types of games moving forward, because a lot of changes have happened in the trading card game space over the last couple of years, and we're yet to see the effects on these types of games. So stick with me. After the intro song, we'll get into it. Hey guys, again, thank you so much for joining me. Now, if this is your first time joining us on the Booster Pack podcast or for the YouTube channel for CCG history, I just want to say thanks for joining us, and I'll give you a bit of an idea of what the show's all about. And if you were returning from a previous episode, I'm going to give you an idea of what's been going on and why you're getting this kind of episode before we get into our topic, which is IP or intellectual property-based trading card games, what they've done in the past and what's going to happen with them in the future. So again, if this is your first ever episode of the Booster Pack, welcome. Thank you for joining me. Now, if you have a look at the rest of the feed on this podcast or on the YouTube channel, you're going to see a bunch of other episodes. And the core episodes of the Booster Pack, they'll probably be linked in the description for a playlist, actually feature interviews with creators in the trading card game space, people who have created trading card games over its near 30-year history of the genre. Now, in those episodes, we talk all about different games, everything from Legend of the Five Rings, Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, Lord of the Rings trading card game, everything from A to Z of trading card game history. No game is off limits, and if there's a game in particular you want to hear about, let me know, and we might bring you an episode or interview with a creator or somebody involved with it. Also, let me just tell you about our other types of episodes, which are the rare slot episodes, and they're a casual conversation. You're going to see them on the feed as well with people who are also interested in the trading card game space the same way I am. Sometimes I'll have a unique story. Sometimes we'll just have a topic to chat about. That's another thing to look for, because they are super accessible episodes. Now, there's these episodes that you're watching right now. They're Booster Pack Singles, where I'm just going to talk to the camera and into the microphone, and they can pop up whenever. But today, we would be expecting to see a usual interview with either a creator or somebody on the rare slot, but I had to change the organization for that. Now, let me tell you why. So I just got to go into some personal little details here, and just stick with me for a second so I can tell you what's been going on. So this last month, I had to have some spontaneous surgery and have a tumor removed from my face. You might be able to see a bit of a scar here and there and stuff like that still on me. I'm still sort of recovering. It was supposed to be a really simple surgery. I was supposed to be in hospital for one day and then back home and recovered after about a week. But unfortunately, things changed a little bit, and I had to spend over a week in hospital, and then my recovery period was about 3 weeks. So what I had to do is, instead of being able to keep up with my proper schedule, I had to push all of my interviews into the following month. So in the coming weeks, you will see a bunch of interviews and interesting episodes that we would normally do for the Booster Pack. But at the moment, rather than miss an entire week's episode and not post anything, I thought, hey, this would be a great time to just talk about something that I've had on my mind for a little while now. So that is, of course, the topic at hand, which is intellectual property-based or media franchise-based trading card games or collectible card games. Now, these games have existed almost since the dawn of collectible card games. And what we're going to do is, in this episode, we're going to explore what they've done in the past. And I'm also going to tell you what I think might happen with them in the future, because I do feel like these last couple of years have brought such change to the trading card game space that I honestly think that there's going to be a big difference moving into this next decade. So stick with me. I'm going to organize my thoughts into a couple of different, segments or parts, and just to make things easier to sort of digest and sort of just organize my thoughts a little bit smoother. So here we go with part one, the history of IP or licensed trading card games. All right, so we are going to be talking about my favorite subject first, which, as anybody who's been watching the show for a while will know, is the history of trading card games. So first up, I just want to sort of give you an idea of what I mean by IP-based trading card games. Now, IP, that stands for intellectual property. It's also means maybe a media franchise or a license, something that pre-exists before the game was made, that it can be based on. So obviously there's a ton of famous examples. Pokemon is a really famous example of an IP-based trading card game. Now, it is currently made by a company that is the owner of the IP itself. So it's not licensing it, but it's still basing it on a pre-existing property, which in this case is the Pokemon video games. So in an opposite to that, you've got things like Magic the Gathering, which is a original property that was made for that trading card game. And most recently, you've also got Flesh and Blood, which is something that is an entirely original property that is born through the trading card game as well. And in the past, there's been a couple of very famous examples. Obviously, Legend of the Five Rings is one. And just recently, we spoke to somebody who designed for the Spoils, another game that was sort of debuting its own IP with the game itself. But mostly, over the last almost 30 years of trading card games, the vast majority of them have been based on something that existed before. Now, these are usually media franchises that have existed from outside of the gaming space, but there is some that were based on gaming properties and stuff like that, especially tabletop gaming properties early on. So let's wind back and sort of talk about the first couple of years of the trading card game space and sort of what happened with licensing early on. So 1993 is where trading card games begin, because of course Magic comes out in the summer of 1993. Now, that was an amazing year for culture. You had things like Power Rangers for the kids, you had Nirvana for the teens, and I'm sure a whole bunch of other stuff that was happening around the world at the time. But really the most important thing was the advent of the trading card game, in my opinion, because it basically transformed hobby gaming throughout it. Now, within the first year of it being out, from the summer of 1993 all the way into 1994, you had a bunch of other gaming properties bring out trading card games. So you first and foremost had Spellfire, which was Dungeons and Dragons, but made into a trading card game. Obviously, the gameplay was very different. And if you are interested in something like that, you can go back and check out our episode with the designer of that game. There's some fascinating stories there. But that was the first ever trading card game to follow Magic, and it was based on a gaming IP. Following Magic was Richard Garfield's second game, which was at the time called Jihad, but is more commonly known as its second title, which is Vampire: The Eternal Struggle. There's some history there, and in fact, there's another episode on this channel all about that if you go back and look at that. But that was based on a license from another gaming company, a tabletop RPG company called Vampire: The Masquerade. Now, those aren't the games I'm really talking about today. Specifically, for the sake of this conversation, I really want to talk about games that are based on outside gaming media, or at least non-tabletop gaming media. So video games and stuff like that is okay to talk about, and movies, of course, but things like RPGs and board game properties and stuff like that is not something I really want to dig into for today's episode or for today's purpose. So as I was talking about it, we saw those first couple of games come out in 1994, and at the end of 1994, something new was tried by a company called Decipher. Now, Decipher became famous for these kinds of games, these licensed or franchise-based trading card games throughout the 1990s, and they were pretty much the second biggest publisher of trading card games throughout that era. Now, their first attempt at this was the Star Trek collectible card game, or customizable card game, I believe it was officially called. And what it did is it took the world of Star Trek and presented it through this collectible card game lens using original rules. Now, previously, just regular trading cards, similar to baseball cards, had existed for Star Trek and other IPs and franchises and stuff like that. But this was the first time that you really saw an outside media franchise that was sort of world famous, and specifically in this case, Star Trek: The Next Generation, come into the gaming space and sort of explode and sort of become one of the major players in the gaming space, one of the most profitable items in the gaming space at that time. So what we had designers at Decipher who created a game based on what you would expect to see in the media when you were experiencing another Star Trek story. They worked with the license holders who were Paramount, I believe, at the time, and they actually crafted this game to be an extension of the Star Trek universe. So you played a game that was sort of very narratively driven. You had these games that you would see where you would be traveling to planets and playing characters and playing dilemmas, and all this narrative structure is built into the rules because it was based on this already existing property that you could basically play the story of Star Trek however you wanted through the lens of this game. Now, to be opposite of that, where Magic the Gathering, yes, you could sort of extract a story from playing a game of Magic the Gathering, two wizards who meet and fight a battle. It's very procedural and very mechanically driven. It's very much there's this phase and then there's this phase and then there's this phase, and everything sort of works together because the mechanics of the game sort of want to drive the gameplay first. Whereas in a game like Star Trek, it's arguable, but you could definitely say that the gameplay in that was a lot more narrative driven. It was, yes, there was mechanics, and yes, there was phases and stuff like that. But at the same time, phases, funny. There was definitely phases, but there was phases of gameplay where you could certainly recreate Star Trek experiences. You know, your Captain Kirk could be on the Enterprise and facing a dilemma of some sort or whatever. There was a red alert or something like that on the ship, and all this crazy stuff started to happen. But that is sort of the real first entry into this sort of outside media IP driven game come out and sort of experience that through the lens of trading card games. Now, Decipher followed that up the following year with the Star Wars customizable card game, which was the second biggest trading card game throughout the 90s. Obviously, the Star Wars franchise very, very much helped that, and it really drove sales of that game. There was collectors and there was people who didn't even play, but there was a bunch of people who played as well. And again, this is an arguable thing, but the same designers who designed the Star Trek game designed the Star Wars game. And again, it was a very narrative-driven, narrative-first trading card game, or customizable card game in its specific case. Basically, what happened there is you could play different characters to planets, and you could have Luke hold his lightsaber, or you could have Leia, flying the Millennium Falcon if you wanted. You could sort of customize the world of Star Wars and tell these narratives with the cards that you had in booster packs and stuff like that. And you could team up characters like IG-88 and Chewbacca, things that you would never see in the movies, because you could sort of drive this narrative story through the lens of this game yet again. And again, as I said, that was a huge success. And those two games sort of really broke through the shield of like outside media franchises coming into trading card games, and especially the hobby space. I mean, board games for those sort of things that existed before, but these were really the first examples where collectible or trading card games were embracing these outside franchises. And this sort of continued, but throughout the 90s, most of the trading card games were based on, most of the famous ones were based on sort of high tier sort of tabletop gaming properties, mostly role-playing games. Things like Rage was based on the Werewolf role-playing game, and then there was a bunch of other ones as well. One based on the Edge, the Over the Edge RPG. There's a whole bunch of other ones, and that was sort of where the gaming industry went first. Throughout the 90s, though, as it starts to come to the end of 1990s, you basically then get a couple of extra trading card games that start coming in that sort of start to mix in that sort of IP-based space. So one of the most famous examples was a system-based game by Wizards of the Coast after they had made all of their 4 sort of Deckmaster games that were based on RPGs. After, as we mentioned, Vampire: The Eternal Struggle, there was also Netrunner, which was based on the Cyberpunk RPG. And of course, there's Battletech, which was based on FICE's RPG there as well. But they started to explore, because they wanted to reach a wider audience, pop culture franchises. And what they started with Legend of Hercules and the Xena TV shows, which were really popular in the mid-90s at the time. There was also another property that they did within this same gaming system, but that was created for the system itself. But those two were really sort of a huge example of where these outside media franchises were sort of starting to come in and sort of become a regular part of the trading card game space, so that people who were in big stores like Walmarts and Targets would see these games and then grab them and then sort of be channeled through into the hobby space as they started to play them and explore them. Obviously, there were people who just collected them, like there was with the Star Trek CCG or the Star Wars CCG, but also the hope was to capture a more mass market non-gaming audience there with this sort of bait on the hook, so to speak, of these TV franchises that were way more recognizable than some of the RPGs that had come before it. So Wizards was experimenting with this. They did it through the Arc system, which was sort of like a Magic Light system, used similar rules to Magic. And that, I think, was an issue in and of itself, because it wanted to use those two properties to be able to engage with each other. And I'm sure that there was plans or thoughts that they would be able to introduce other pop culture sort of franchises into this world, and they'd be all compatible to fight against one another. But using this sort of Magic Light system wasn't super successful, because first of all, it just felt like a watered down version of Magic, and hobby gamers were like, well, if I want to play Magic, I'll just play Magic. And people from outside the hobby game space probably sort of felt, I would assume, I certainly have revisiting those games, sort of felt that those games really didn't tell or play like an episode of Hercules or Xena. You know, not often would you be in Hercules or Xena summoning monsters on your side as well alongside Xena to fight people like Hercules or other Xenas or Gabrielles or anything like that. But that is a real first example of the way that Wizards of the Coast started to incorporate IPs. Now, that's about 1997, 1998. And at this point in trading card game history, the industry has sort of gotten through the boom years and things are starting to dwindle. The hangers on, the really popular games, obviously Magic, obviously the IP-based ones like Star Trek and Star Wars, and Legend of the Five Rings is another outlier that was really sort of holding up the industry as sort of the core games in that era. There was other IP-based games, you know, like Babylon 5 that was doing okay at the time, but it really wasn't until 1999 that the industry changed as a whole, especially when you turn a lens towards these media franchise-based trading card games or collectible card games. Because what happened in 1999 is, anybody old enough to remember, Pokemon. Pokemania swept popular culture, and the first and foremost sort of product in that mania outside of the video games was the trading card game that Wizards of the Coast had shipped over and retranslated from the Japanese version, which had come out years earlier. And what happened is that game sort of introduced a whole slew of audience to the whole trading card game space. So basically what happened there is kids for the first time were the targeted audience for trading card games, and it went like wildfire. Now, there's a lot of theories that if they were just regular playing cards, they might have sold just as much. The fact that there was a game was sort of a secondary to the fact that they were Pokemon, but it actually introduced a ton of kids to be able to sort of get into the world of trading card games. And that sort of ignited the industry to go, oh, we've been marketing trading card games towards college students because that's where Magic was first targeted, and adults with disposable income. Let's target kids, and by proxy, their parents. You know, so all of a sudden in the trading card game space, first and foremost, kid stuff went wild. You had IPs based on a whole bunch of kids franchises, and by proxy as well, you also had a whole bunch based on Japanese anime franchises. Things like Dragon Ball Z and things like Sailor Moon came out the following year. Digimon obviously followed as well with its own trading card, Digi Battle trading card game, which was sort of a janky import of the Japanese version that didn't really play the same. And ultimately other kids franchises as well all of a sudden became involved, and these things became more mass market acceptable, because, you know, you stick that in an impulse aisle in Target or Walmart or in the toy aisle and they start selling immediately. So these games sort of reignited the trading card game space for an entirely different audience, thanks to the success of the Pokemon trading card game. Now, again, it's another video, but we could talk about the fact that had that not been a game, had that just been regular trading cards, the entire industry could be looking different from today. But why I want to talk about that as well is from there, you start to see a bunch of other trading card games come out. And you start to see import franchises like, you know, One Piece and Full Metal Alchemist get released. Other franchises like the Dot Hack series from Decipher was another anime series that, or video game series that sort of had its own IP-based trading card game. Now, the other thing is, while we're talking about Decipher, let's just turn the lens back to Decipher as well, because at the same time, you know, they had been doing the Star Wars thing, they'd been doing the Star Trek thing, and then all of a sudden another big sort of Hollywood franchise starts to come along in the early 2000s, just after Pokemon, and that is, of course, Lord of the Rings. Now, Lord of the Rings was a huge thing at the time, and in fact, some report that that trading card game that Decipher had brought out from back then actually even outsold Magic the Gathering for a couple of months in its first earlier release when the first Fellowship of the Rings movie was coming out, which is absolutely unheard of for any other trading card game to really sort of challenge Magic's throne. It didn't last, obviously, but those early sort of days were something that was going on there with the Lord of the Rings trading card game. And we're going to come back to that a little bit later on. But between Decipher and between this new sort of discovered Pokemon era sort of boom in trading card games, of licensed trading card games, especially ones, like I said, towards kids and anime franchises, this is sort of what sort of cemented trading card games as a mass market genre. And it's definitely, I'm sure, a reason why there's a ton of people in the trading card game space now, especially from Pokemon, but also, you know, they could have jumped from franchise to franchise. I've spoken to people who gotten into trading card games, not from Pokemon, not from Yu-Gi-Oh, not from Magic the Gathering, but because there was some other toy aisle scene game that they sort of came on or discovered, and sort of then sort of brought them into the hobby gaming space, which was the initial intention of things like the Arc system that we talked about before with Xena and Hercules, but just at a younger sort of audience scale. Now, what we want to sort of do is we're going to sort of look forward and see where these trading card games have sort of gone over the last couple of years, especially more recently. So more recently, the reason we're talking about this today is because the way I see trading card games going, I really feel like there's going to be a bit of a change in the industry, because especially once we get to it, we'll get into it in the next segment, but Magic is going to start incorporating more and more sort of IPs and licenses into its rule system. And we'll sort of get there in a moment. But before we do, let's just talk about more recent years and sort of what's happened over the last sort of decade since that Pokemon boom. We're going to talk about what sort of happened with licensed gaming sort of in the trading card game space since. So a couple of games have come out in that time that are license based, and some of them are doing really well. One of the most famous examples, or most endearing examples, is the Final Fantasy trading card game that's imported from Japan. It's still going. I think it's in its 7th or 8th year now, and it's still going. You know, not super strong, but you know, some stores have their niche for that particular game. The other one, obviously, that comes to mind, another couple, are the Transformers trading card game from Wizards of the Coast the last couple of years. And that's especially interesting because we'll talk about Wizards of the Coast in the next segment, and specifically Transformers as well. Other than that, of course, there's been a couple of other trading card games and stuff, but primarily in this sort of new era, you're not seeing a bunch of IP-based trading card games because we've sort of got to this Kickstarter sort of indie trading card game era where people want to own their own IP as they release trading card games and sort of use the trading card game as a launching platform for a greater media presence. So, you know, for example, if Flesh and Blood, this new IP that is centered in a trading card game, wants to expand into a TV show or novels or something like that, the trading card game would be a launching point for that. And the narrative of the trading card game is, you know, you're sort of seeing this as well with a game called MetaZoo, where it's basically using the trading card game. It's not really doing too much in the game side of the space, but using it as a pop culture sort of launching pad for the other things it wants to do. I believe that there's a TV show coming for this game and a video game coming. So it's something that wants to grow out of this. And that's something that's really popular in this sort of new indie era. But we haven't seen in the last couple of years tons of IP-based games. Now, we will get into talking about those IP-based games in just a second and what I think that the future is going to hold. But the last thing I want to mention that sort of really I feel like has been the precursor to a new shift I want to talk about is a specific set of promo cards for Magic the Gathering, because Magic the Gathering is really what I think is going to shape and change the way that we look at IP-based trading card games moving into the future. Now, Magic the Gathering had not really done anything pop culture related. You know, there'd been custom cards online where people had, you know, taken characters from their favorite TV shows and mocked up a Magic card. But in 2017, Wizards of the Coast, or Hasbro themselves, had a convention where they were specifically showing off Hasbro properties. And of course, Magic the Gathering was one of those. But alongside that, there was other Hasbro properties like Transformers. There was My Little Pony. There was Dungeons and Dragons, and, you know, all the other kids' toys and stuff like that that Hasbro does. And what they did is they created a 3-card set that actually was a bunch of promo Magic cards that featured characters from those other franchises. So like I said, there was the Transformers. There was a Transformers one that was a double-sided Magic card with Grimlock on it, I think. There was a sword from Dungeons and Dragons. There was some My Little Pony stuff that came a little bit later. And I think there was a My Little Pony in that particular set as well. But those were the first times widely available Magic cards had actual other IPs on them that I know of. And I believe that that was sort of testing for what's going to come in the future. So we're going to talk about Magic the Gathering. We're going to talk about collectible card game and trading card game systems and what that means moving into the future, and why trading card games at the moment are going to be changing in the way that we've seen them in the last couple of years. Like, I don't believe we're going to see the sort of boom that we did in the 1990, 1999, sort of 2000 period in this new era, because there's going to be a different way that licenses are going to approach the way the trading card games are made for their products, I believe. So let's talk about that in part 2. Things are changing. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what is changing in the trading card game space when it comes to these sort of IP-based games, or these licensed media franchise-centric trading card games moving forward. Because things are changing in the trading card game space. More widely, there is a ton of different things that have happened over the last 2 to 3 years, maybe even a little bit before, in the trading card game space that has shaped the way that we look at trading card games. Now, we don't have time to go into all of those, but before we do, I do want to just do a little bit of history and sort of talk about what we just talked about in the previous segment and how we're going to experience things a little bit differently over the last couple of years. But before we do, there's three games I want to talk about, but two up front I want to talk about, and then we're going to get to that last one, which is the big conversation piece. So what it is I want to talk about these two games at first. They are UFS, also known as Universes nowadays, which is a multi-franchise trading card game, or a super licensed trading card game, as I've heard some people call it. Basically, what that does is that every single set, or almost every single set, it has a new licensed property that it creates cards out of, and they can all battle each other all together. Like, for example, an anime series called My Hero Academia just had a huge success in this particular TCG or CCG system of UFS, or Universes. But a couple of years ago, there was another anime franchise, Cowboy Bebop, that came out from that exact same system. So that system is, in theory, able to play Cowboy Bebop characters against My Hero Academia characters using this sort of general fighting system of trading card games sort of rule set that it's sort of crafted. Now, going back even further, there was Mega Man sets, there was Street Fighter sets, and in fact, everything is sort of combat based in that particular game as far as the sort of challenge and format of the game sort of goes. Now, what we're going to be talking about there is the fact that this game has continued to last, and in fact, it started way back in 2006. It's lasted 12 years, although it has changed publisher hands over that time. And what it's done is it has managed to just jump from franchise to franchise. Now, speaking of anime and these sort of super licensed trading card games, or these sort of CCG or TCG system games, where it's a bunch of different IPs able to be played in the same rule set, sort of like what we talked about in the earlier segment with Ark and Xena and Hercules, but that didn't really catch on. We're going to be talking about Way Schwartz, which is a Japanese game, if you're not familiar with it, that uses every single set to sort of engage with a new licensed property using sort of stock assets from the TV show or the anime, and sort of make an entirely new card system and sort of, reflect the mechanics of each sort of card vaguely with those particular franchises that they're using at the time. Like, I think, there has been one Western franchise a couple of Western franchises that have been used in Japan and here in that particular sort of style of that Way Schwartz style, but primarily animes like Sword Art Online and Mob Psycho 100 and stuff like that have all been used in this particular format or whatnot. Now, over that time, it has also lasted more than a decade now, and it has really propelled itself, especially in sort of like the anime-centric sort of fandom, as a really popular game that will give you new and exciting sets every couple of years. So these system-based trading card games are really something that seem to show some longevity. And they've actually gone out and gotten a whole bunch of different licenses, some unexpected or whatnot. And it's actually really quite wild to see what has happened. Like, even Way Schwartz, which is a Japanese trading card game that mainly focuses on anime, a couple of years ago, I think at the end of 2020, even had an Adventure Time Cartoon Network expansion. So that really does show that there is more coming out from them in the future as far as sort of mixing in Western IPs and just seeing how that works for them. Even in Japan, there was an exclusive set for Way Schwartz, I believe, that was just Star Wars. So these are something that these multiple super licensed trading card games are starting to embrace a wider swath of different franchises and stuff to be able to sort of bring out into the trading card game system. So you've got these trading card game systems. Now you've basically had this huge announcement from Magic the Gathering that we've started to see over the last couple of years, starting, of course, with their Secret Lair, but they've started an initiative at Wizards of the Coast called Universes Beyond. Now, if you haven't heard of Universes Beyond, it's essentially basically an imprint for Magic the Gathering cards. And what it's going to aim to do is similar to the way that Wizards of the Coast experimented, again, with the Arc system way back when. It's going to aim to bring a bunch of different franchises into the Magic the Gathering rule set. And essentially, the Magic the Gathering rule set can sort of act as this sort of middle ground for all these other IPs, and people can still have their original Magic cards, but at the same time mix them in with these other franchises. And we've already seen this, as I said, through the Secret Lair product that sort of debuted this, the real mass market wise. We talked about in the earlier segment about the Transformers and stuff that came from those Hasbro promos. but they were silver bordered and sort of experimental. In this new Secret Lair set, you are actually seeing original cards being created from, in the first particular example that I can think of was the Walking Dead. It sort of caused a lot of controversy that there was about 5 or 6 cards that really were Magic cards that were original, that used characters and thematic changes from the Walking Dead itself. Now, the other thing as well is they've also had Stranger Things now, and I believe they've already run the campaign for it, but it'll be coming soon. The Street Fighter license as well in those secret lairs. And the big sort of news at the end of all this Universes Beyond is that Magic the Gathering isn't just doing this as like single promo card sets. They are planning on doing full booster expansions that are coming out. So the first of these that we'll be getting is the Lord of the Rings set for Magic the Gathering, which is actually debuting, I believe, the same year as Amazon's series. So it is expected to be a huge thing. And if we've looked at the history that we talked about with IP-based games, these sort of things bring a lot of people and a lot of eyes into the hobby gaming space that normally wouldn't be there. So fans of Lord of the Rings might decide to pick up these Magic cards when they never would have had an interest in Magic cards before, because these Magic sets not only are using a new IP, but they're actually creating original art for every single piece. So they appeal to collectors as well. And it's actually a pretty wild way that Magic the Gathering has finally started to sort of go from being its own insular game to being a system, a broader trading card game system, like we've seen from Way Schwartz or Universes or UFS over the last couple of years, and a couple of other particular games along the way as well. This is why I think that trading card games, or IP-based trading card games rather, are going to change looking forward. If you're a major license holder, and you have the option to create or work with a publisher to create a brand new trading card game, one where people are expected to learn an entirely new rule set, even if that rule set, like the Star Trek or Star Wars trading card games from the 90s, customizable card games from the 90s did, and had their own sort of, more thematic rule set, you're not going to really want to do that when you've got Magic the Gathering as a property offering you an advantage or an opportunity to sort of be part of their story. And you sort of have the inertia of Magic the Gathering as well as the inertia of your own brand selling your cards. So I think moving forward, we are going to see Magic the Gathering embracing this sort of systems, like this Universes Beyond sort of systemization of the Magic the Gathering rule set. And we're going to see less and less original card games come out. We might see more sort of CCG systems or TCG systems get born, or even more diverse sets come out for games like Universes or Way Schwartz or anything like that. It's going to be really interesting to see. But I think that if there's a Lord of the Rings Magic set, the Tolkien license holder is not really going to be interested in creating their own collectible card game for Lord of the Rings with its own rules. Now, if we go back to what happened in the early 2000s when the Lord of the Rings movies came out and it had its own trading card game from Decipher, there was a lot of buzz around that game, but it would have been probably so much more bigger if it also worked into the Magic rule set. And in fact, there's a little bit of history where Lord of the Rings was also a trading card game that maybe Wizards of the Coast was thinking of working on in the mid-90s, but that's another video altogether. But what I'm just trying to get at here is that these new ways of creating IP-based cards for a card game, whether it's a super system one or whether it's working into Magic the Gathering, I think that this major properties are going to work that way. Now, we've had, to speak to Star Wars, we've had at least 7 Star Wars trading card games in English released over the last sort of almost 3 decades. Now, does that stop happening when we have a new Star Wars movie come out and the option for Hasbro, who does the toys for Star Wars, have the option to do a Magic the Gathering set? Like, why would we look to getting another Destiny or another Star Wars trading card game like we had in the past, when we can just add these characters into the Magic the Gathering sort of rule set and sell the game not only as a Star Wars product, but as a Magic product as well? I think that licenses are going to be way more enthusiastic about joining Magic's momentum than sort of forging their own with a new publisher, which is really sort of sad. We'll talk about it in the next section, but I do feel like it's not something that's going to be very innovative for the trading card game space. Now, as I said, we've got these franchises coming out. Lord of the Rings is the big booster set. There's also Commander products, which, if you're not familiar, Commander is Magic the Gathering's sort of casual, format for sort of more or less intensive players that sort of just, it's like a multiplayer format, it's longer games. And in fact, they actually have, it's another gaming property, but they have announced that there will be Warhammer themed decks in those sets. And the interesting thing I think here is that one of the announcements they've made about Magic in this particular case is that these theme decks won't be color balanced. So they won't actually represent the 5 colors of Magic evenly, which is something almost all other Magic products have done to date. So to sort of lean into the franchise and what that means for Warhammer, they've sort of gone, all right, this feels more naturally this type of Magic color than any of the others. So we're going to sort of lean into that a little bit more. And I think that that actually brings up an interesting point, because the problem with bringing all these Magic the Gathering, these IPs into Magic the Gathering, is that Magic the Gathering system is very regimented in what it can do. And there are other IPs that can sort of don't really mesh with that. So Magic sort of represents 5 colors. And, I mentioned before, 1993 was the year Power Rangers came out, for example. Now that's another franchise that is based exclusively around colors. But the colors in Power Rangers and the colors in Magic don't really mesh very well. So, okay, there's a yellow Power Ranger, but no yellow color in Magic. And would that even make sense for Magic cards? Like Magic's color system represents certain things philosophically, whereas in Power Rangers, the colors are sort of interchangeable. But if you have a character who is really smart in Power Rangers, that might be a blue character in Magic for one. Unfortunately, in Power Rangers original series, the smart character was blue. But when you come across something like a green character, like the green character in the first series of Power Rangers was initially an evil character who sort of acted selfishly, which is black in Magic's color pie. So you're going to have a Green Ranger that also has a black card, so it's a black card Green Ranger, whereas the Green Ranger isn't the green card. It's really quite confusing. It's something that I'm really going to have to see how these IP creators sort of wrap their head around this sort of situation, and really sort of explore what it means to be not only a Magic card, but also belong to another property as well. So far, we've seen with the Stranger Things and with the Walking Dead, we've seen gold cards a lot, so a lot of like mixing of the color sort of philosophies and stuff. But when you start to engage with other properties, like for example, the last Airbender series, what's it called, Avatar, is based on 4 different elements. So fire, earth, wind, and water. But in Magic the Gathering, fire and earth are both designated specifically to the red color, whereas wind and water are both specifically designated to the blue color. So if they were to do an IP-based Avatar game, where do you really draw the line there? What happens to the green cards or the white cards in that situation? It's a really interesting thought when Magic the Gathering is starting to embrace this new universes beyond system. And it really does ask the question, where are we going to get new IP-based trading card games if this system-based thing for Magic, or even to a lesser extent Universes or Way Schwartz, or another trading card game, fighting trading card game system that might come out in the future, where does that sort of leave IP and franchise owners and license owners when they are approaching entering the trading card game space? And with so much excitement and interest in the trading card game space since, COVID hit and sort of the last few years, it really begs the question, what kind of conversations are happening right now with these license holders outside of the Magic system, outside of those universes sort of systems that we've sort of talked about already. So that's what I really think is going to be different moving forward. I think ultimately, in summary of this section, I just want to say that I think we're going to see way less original trading card games like we saw from Decipher, where each sort of property or franchise is its own thing. And we're going to see way more system-based things, whether that's Universes Beyond from Magic, where yes, I'm sure these IPs will bring their own mechanics of sorts and their own way of interpreting the Magic rule system, but it will still at the end of the day be about playing lands and getting your life points to 0. Whereas the Lord of the Rings set, which we talked about with Magic, obviously isn't going to incorporate the sort of thematic gameplay rule system that, say, Lord of the Rings did for Decipher way back when. Now, we're going to explore that a little bit more in the next section, but I do just want to say that I think that that might lead to a little less innovation when it comes to IP-based trading card games. So hopefully the system is going to reward us as fans of those shows, but we're going to just have to wait and sort of find out moving forward. So let's go into section 3, where we sort of can talk about this a little bit wider. the consequences and innovation of IP-based trading card games moving forward. All right, so here we are in the last part of the video. Now, this time I want to sort of talk about what I sort of see for the future based on everything that we've talked about so far. You know, we've talked about the past, we've talked about what licensed trading card games have done over the last 3 decades. And I sort of mentioned it at the end there of that last segment, what I think is going to happen moving forward for trading card games in the future that are based on IPs. So the biggest thing I think that is going to change is that, yes, we are going to see more licenses going to things like Magic the Gathering or other sort of system-based trading card games in the future. Now, what we're going to talk about now is sort of a problem I see with that, because what's happened, if we look at the history of trading card games, those franchises or licenses have actually really done something good for the trading card game space. What they've done is they've really helped innovate in different ways because they've been able to introduce new elements into every single particular trading card game so far. So let me break that down a little bit. So we talked a little bit about Decipher's Lord of the Rings previously. Now that was a trading card game that really innovated in some space when it comes to the property for Lord of the Rings and for the way that Decipher made trading card games. So we're talking about Lord of the Rings. In Lord of the Rings, if you've never played it in the trading card game from Decipher, it was a very unique style of gameplay. There was a path in the middle where people would travel along to move the one ring to the end of it. It would also sort of help Decipher discover that you can mix good guys and bad guys in the same deck, whereas in their previous Star Wars game and even their Austin Powers game, there was decks where you would split it between good guys and bad guys, whereas the innovation there in the trading card game space for Lord of the Rings was a little bit more fluid, and you could sort of have these 2 different types of pools where you were it wasn't the first time it was done, but you could be playing good guys and bad guys on alternating turns. And a bunch of other trading card games have done that since, and even a couple did it before. But this was a real huge innovation and sort of taught us what more could happen in the trading card game space. You know, there are other IP-based trading card games that did some really interesting stuff. You know, there was the Initial D trading card game from Alderac. And without that, you know, how else would we know what a racing trading card game could do? You know, if they were going to make their own sort of battle-centric game, we never would have got the mechanics that that game sort of gave us. Now, there are other games as well throughout the years where the IP that the game is based on is such a driving force to the way that the gameplay works. So let's talk about the Transformers trading card game most recently from Wizards of the Coast. You know, this is Wizards of the Coast, who are now stepping into this Universes Beyond sort of system, were actually way back in 2016 developing this idea, and then eventually it came out a couple of years later. But this idea of having like giant robots battling. So you would have like a flipping card so that you would actually literally have the cards transform. Now, they'd done double-faced cards before, but these were oversized giant cards, and you had a team that could work together, and it really sort of helped the franchise. The gameplay was really helped along by how the franchise sort of played and what the stories of those games really were. And that really helped innovate in the trading card game space. And I'm sure, I don't know of any off the top of my head, but I'm sure there were lessons that were learned when the Wizards of the Coast's R&D team was making the Transformers game that were applied to Magic. I know that way back when Wizards of the Coast took their shot at their own Star Wars trading card game, they took mechanics and lessons that the team had learned from that game and applied them to Magic the Gathering's future sets, and even shaped mechanics and crafted things that had not been thought of in Magic the Gathering, because this rule set from Star Wars had helped innovate the way that they looked at trading card games in general. Now, I feel like when you're going into a system-based IP, you're not exploring that same kind of space. I mentioned it before, but yes, there'll be mechanics based on this sort of thing in the Magic rule system, or in the Universes rule system, or in the Way Swartz rule system, but it's not the same. Again, as I said before, Magic is always going to be about taking your opponent's life points down to 0. Or there could be alternate win condition cards, but at the same time, it's always going to be also about playing lands. Like, the rule system is sort of set so the cards can continue to interact in the way that they've always done before. And now that Magic the Gathering's introducing Lord of the Rings, like, they're not going to have a path. They're not going to have, you know, a shadow or a twilight pool like the Decipher Lord of the Rings game did. They're not going to have that same level of innovation. If you continue to add new franchises to these systems, you are missing the opportunity of innovating the game and the rule set in the way that the industry and the way that the tabletop game TCG genre has in the past. And I think that that's a missed opportunity. Now, fortunately, on the other side of that, with the things like indie TCG movements via things like Kickstarter and HTCGs, there is a lot of innovation, fortunately, for new and original rule systems. People are coming up with ideas. You know, I get contacted by people who listen to this show who are creating their own card games and sort of basing it on IPs of their own, or shaping the game first and then grafting their own original IP on it, so that the flavor of the game and the thematic gameplay sort of meld together really well. And I'm super excited to see what comes of those in the future. And I think that that's where the innovation will be moving forward, rather than where the innovation was previously, when they were building games based on IPs over the last sort of 30 years. And it's something that I'm really, really excited to look forward to. Now, that sort of brings me to the end of this episode, but I do want to give you guys the opportunity to as well give me your thoughts on everything we've talked about today. I want to say thanks if you're still watching at this point in the video. And I also just want to see, you know, what do you see the future of IP-based trading card games being? And what do you want that future to be? You know, do you want these cards to come out in Magic system? Would you prefer, you know, a John Wick set for Magic the Gathering over John Wick having his own trading card game? That's a ridiculous example, but the first thing that came to mind for some reason. I want to hear what you have to say. So let me know. You can let me know via the comments if you're watching this on YouTube. You can let me know via our email, which is theboosterpack@ccghistory.com. You can let me know via social media, which is facebook.com/ccghistory. My DMs are open there, so you can send me a direct message or just comment on a post or the post of this episode. Or, of course, where I'm most active, which is on Twitter, which is twitter.com/ccghistory. You can DM me there as well, or even just reach out or say something. That's where you're going to get me probably most of the time, most frequently. But let me know through any of those means. And I am just fascinated to hear what you think about all of this future and past of IP-based trading card games. And in fact, what's been your favorite outside non-gaming IP-based trading card game to date so far? Like, what's something that you've loved? What was your favorite system or your favorite innovation that one of these games brought out? So thank you so much for watching. As well, if you were interested in any of the games we talked about today, you can check the links below, because there'll be a link to Category 1 Games, which is a website that sells a bunch of older trading card games, classic collectible card games. So you might be able to start a collection or improve the collection that you already have. And lastly, I just want to say, please, if you liked this sort of conversation, let me know, give me your feedback, because if this is the sort of thing you want to hear more of, sometimes I'll try and work these sort of episodes in a little bit more often. If not, I'll stick to what we've been doing before. But please, if you're first time here, please subscribe if you haven't already. Follow me on social media. All of those things help tons when it comes to sort of bringing you new episodes, whether it's this kind of episode or the traditional interview episodes that we do. And if this is your very, very first time, go back and look at the previous catalog of episodes and look through the creators we've talked to and see if they've actually worked on any games that you might be interested in hearing a little secret history of. Or even if there isn't somebody there that you wanted to hear from, tell me who you want to hear from or what games you want to hear about. And in the future, we might be able to bring you an episode there all about that. So thank you so, so much for joining me for this whole episode. Again, I want to hear from you about anything to go in regards to trading card games or in regards to this kind of episode or anything like that. And remember, until next time, keep shuffling.